Hello and welcome everyone to our next episode of Minerva PLM TV. I'm Jennifer Moore, your host, and I have with me today another very special guest, Michael Williams, software engineer here at Minerva. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me. So why don't we get started just by telling me a little bit about yourself, some of your background, and how you ended up at Minerva.
Sure. Well, basically, I'm a software engineer. I've been doing engineering for off and on about 30 years. Started out as a mathematician. I actually got my bachelor's degree in mathematics and then switched over to computer science for my master's degree. I've done engineering in many different fields, everything from student loan banking to data mining. I've also done biotech work. I've worked with the instrumentation group at a major biotech doing blood machines, blood testing machines. That's some of the stuff that we're seeing actually being used for the COVID-19 testing.
Oh, wow.
Is
That's
one of the
amazing
instruments that I worked on. So yeah, it's been a very diverse background. I've worked many times with scientists and other engineers, so there's always been a draw for me to the technical side of the domains that I'm in. And that kind of led me to Minerva. When I was on the market, I happened to see an ad looking for engineering in engineering backgrounds. And so I replied to that, and here I am.
And here we are.
Here we are.
The rest is history. Awesome. So tell me a little bit about what you do here at Minerva. How do you help our customers and support different projects that are in the product lifecycle management space?
Yep, yeah, it's a good question. Software engineers are kind of the behind-the-scenes guys here at Minerva. Most of our clients deal with our solution consultants, our solution architects. The software engineers are the very technical guys behind the work. We're the coders, we're the database managers, we're the database administrators. Lots of times the solution architects will come to us with the requirements that a client has, and we're the guys that make a lot of that happen. So ours is mostly a support role. We do interface with clients, and that's not an unusual thing to happen for us, but that's not our primary focus. Our primary focus is supporting our software, our solution consultants.
Excellent. Very good. So a lot of times, to my understanding, whenever you're getting requirements back from solution consultants and whatnot, and it really doesn't matter what industry a company is in, it's your job to kind of translate the business need into what the actual solution will look like in the end, whether that's automating a particular process or adding a button that maybe somebody thinks will help increase their productivity. Is that relatively accurate?
That's extremely accurate portrayal of what we do.
Okay.
A lot of times the solution consultants will have a very good idea of what they want. Sometimes, in a lot of cases, we'll get a partial implementation.
Okay.
And then it's our job to interpret both the requirements that the solution architect brings to us and the technical needs that the client has. And so a lot of times we're sort of doing a meshing of those two things. In a sense, it's our job to really make sure the requirements are met on the technical side. Where the solution consultant or the solution architect is making sure the requirements are met on the business side. And so it's often a very collaborative effort between the two parties there. Depending on the team and depending on the solution and depending on the requirement, you'll have different levels of interaction there. Lots of times the solution architect can do all of the work, depending on what the requirement is. And of course, on the other side of that coin, lots of times you just need a software guy to crank out a bunch of code and make something work. And it really
that's
depends.
Probably true for every PLM company in the world, or any
Yes.
software company really in the world. It's the same across the board.
That's a very great point. It really doesn't matter what the domain is. It could be PLM, it could be mortgage banking, it could be data mining. Many times you're going to have this teamwork, this symbiosis between the business-facing guys and the software, the technical guys.
Okay, great. So whenever you get involved into a project, I'm sure there's varying levels of complexity across the board, depending on what, a company wants to do and how they're internally defining PLM and how mature their processes are and all of these different things. What would you say are some of the common things that you see in companies whenever they're trying to adopt any type of new software technology? What's happening in their project, how you help guide them to a positive end result? What are some things that they should take into consideration?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we see this quite a lot in our field, especially here in the U.S. PLM is more of an emerging uh, technology, an emerging technique than it is in other places, I think.
Even though it's been
Um,
around for almost 30 years now?
yeah, a lot of companies really are, we call them, and please don't take offense, anybody that this might describe, we call them PLM naive. And that's not to say that the business doesn't have these processes. Lots of times what we actually see is they have very well-defined processes.
Hmm.
They just haven't put them under the PLM umbrella and knitted them together in a really cohesive way. And so to answer your question, one of the first things that we do is we go in and we try to judge a company on a couple of things. Are they PLM sophisticated? Are they PLM naive?
And that can
Um,
come from two places, really, because the people that are working there may have some PLM sophistication from previous companies that they've worked for, but the company that they're in now may not as a whole have that experience. So it can be a
and
person or company.
Yep, and that's a great point. And in a lot of cases, uh, especially with engineers, you bring a lot of different experience with you, but it doesn't necessarily translate into directly into the organization that you're in at that point.
Hmm.
And a lot of times, it's funny because we'll go into a place and it's not that the process is really broken. These are pretty successful companies usually.
Absolutely.
They're making money, they're doing something right. A lot of times it's not let's go in and totally revamp everything you're doing. A lot of times it's you're already doing something right. Let's make sure you have a tool, or let's define a process that will help you get better or be more efficient. And
So
that's
doing some of that like automation and just things that make their lives easier so that they don't have to do everything in an Excel spreadsheet or email or look for the
exactly
latest in the
right.
file. Yeah, okay.
Exactly right. And
Yeah.
the one thing that here in the U.S. that we really see a lot of is what we call the ECO process for
Hmm.
in the PLM space. It may be different for other companies, but everybody has a change management order or a change request or something like that. There are a
Hmm.
lot of similarities that we see between different companies. Every company is entirely unique in the way that they implement it,
Hmm.
but there's a lot of similarities in the way that the process works, and we know what's successful and what's not. So that's the other thing that we try to judge when we go into a company is um, it how can we assist them getting better at the change management process. And that's really the biggest question that we try to answer when we first are introducing a project or introducing ourselves to a potential client. um, how do you do things? How can we help? you know those are two different questions, and a lot of times it's our job just to come in and try to find that space in the middle where we can really be of assistance.
Hmm. And again, that's probably true for any type of initiative they're looking at. So
Yep.
whenever a company is thinking, okay, I have some processes that I could probably make better, there's a way for me to support my organization in either reducing cost or making more money, because that's always what it comes down to.
Yep.
Enabling your people to do, better things with their time, like innovating new products or whatever the case may be there. It kind of sounds like there's a few things that they can check off to set themselves up for success whenever entering a new software project. So I've heard from you already, maturity level
Mhm.
of working with business systems, and then maturity of business processes.
Mhm.
And on the back end of that, you started to talk a little bit about like willingness to change. So whenever you're
Yes.
working with somebody from the outside, hearing their experiences and understanding that they may bring some different perspectives or knowledge to your organization, and how can you as a company benefit from that, Or do you really want to keep the change processes that you have and just making sure that you're making those determinations and understanding the perspectives as you move forward?
Yeah, and that's a really, really great point that you make. Um, Moving forward, do you want to change?
Mm-hmm.
Do you like the processes you have? And so there are those times when we go into a client and they say, yes, yes, we're ready to do this, but really they aren't. And so then it's a matter of a little bit of finagling and massage and, well, let's really run through the process and show you what you can do better.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, it is automation. Like you said, a lot of times you can't just solve a problem by throwing software at it. It
Right.
just doesn't work that way. You have to be willing to adapt, not just to a tool, but to a process, or adapt an entirely new process. And notice we really, in this whole discussion, we really haven't talked a lot about software.
Right.
It,
That's
and
true. It's people.
it's not always the software's problem. Sometimes it is the people. And you know, we talked about people coming in with varying backgrounds. Lots of times those backgrounds kind of lead to some conflict in the process of changing to a better process.
Mm-hmm.
um, Everybody has good input, everybody has valid ideas, and you've got to be a good negotiator in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways. This is where software guys aren't usually not good. This is where we leave it to the solution consultants. Usually those guys are very good at the business process and they can make that happen. You know,
Mm-hmm.
let's come together, let's figure out what works, let's figure out what it is we really want,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of times that's another question too. What is it we really want? And that's very different than what we need.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know, so eh, those are what do I want to call it? Hurdles that we have to get over to get to a really good implementation of a process. And sometimes software is a hurdle.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's that the tool isn't working right, and we have a process that we like, and the tool doesn't support us. Well, then you know there's a very clear job for the software engineer. If it's the other way where the process is broken, the tool is fine, but the
Mm-hmm.
process doesn't work because there are too many steps, or then a lot of times what we've seen, and we've seen clients recently with this, is that the entire process has to change. And if there's that resistance to change, that unwillingness to really adapt to a new way of working, there,
Doesn't matter what tool you're going to use.
it doesn't matter what tool you're using. It doesn't matter how much code you throw at it. It doesn't matter how much money you spend. It's going to be a problem.
Okay. So again, a kind of theme that I'm hearing as I'm talking to more and more people in, different industries within the software space and particularly PLM is this idea of organizational change management,
Yep.
right? Going back to that topic a little bit and really understanding the impact on your organization as a whole. So from a software engineering perspective and the, projects that you've dealt with and how companies break down that pie to make it beneficial to their people and more readily acceptable, whether they're enabling a digital process that they already have or maybe adopting a new process. What are some things that you would suggest that they try to do to increase, their success from that perspective?
Yeah, I think you have to have buy-in, um, willingness to change. That's a big one. But organizational change management is something that we as Minerva can guide, but it isn't something that we can force. And uh, you know, as a software engineer, you're you're a little bit, your hands are a little bit tied because
You
you know
can show
you're
them what's
the
possible.
you can show them what's possible and they can go, wow, that's great, let's buy it. But you know, the as you said, organizational change management is really the big deal, and it's not just about managing change for a process or your parts or you know something specific. This is inside your organization as we see it from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, this is where we kind of where it's kind of a two-edged sword, if you will, because we're consultants and we're on the outside of the organization. We sometimes have a very uh, high-level view of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, it helps in some ways because we can suggest pretty radical change. But in other
And
ways,
then
that
we just
hinders
look
us.
crazy if they don't like it,
Yeah, exactly.
which can really preserve a project manager's standpoint, because he can say, okay, it was a little bit out of the box, maybe a little bit too far out of the box for the way that our company works. So let's take what we thought was good from those ideas, and again, for any software project that an internal manager is running, and pick apart what we like, what we don't like, and then is there a way for them to break those things down that they do like into more manageable pieces? Like, how, if you're looking at, a
Yep.
big change process, whether it's
Yep.
data mining, which you've got a lot of experience in, or product lifecycle management or whatever, how do they break it down?
Yeah, and this is kind of where the software engineering process itself can help.
Okay.
We often run what are called iterations. There's a very good standardized engineering process in the software world called Agile. And
Okay.
it's been bandied about in a lot of other industries now, but it is particularly effective in software projects.
Mm-hmm.
And as that applies to large organizations and how they manage change, can be very, what's the word I'm looking for? It can help break things down into really bite-sized, manageable chunks. You have a very large process in engineering many times. And it's not always the best thing to just go in and make a huge change. Perhaps, and this is what we as software engineers call a best practice, perhaps the best way to go is to put in a big tool, but only work on parts of the process at a time.
Okay.
Maybe, and we call those in the software world iterations. And
Mm-hmm.
so for each iteration, we're just going to provide a little bit of functionality, a little bit of change. Perhaps it's the way that you deal with an ECO.
Okay.
Perhaps it's cataloging parts. Perhaps it's some reporting tool that you're now adopting.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it's even project management and how your engineers record the time that they spend doing their work. Each one of those can be broken down into even subtasks from that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's our
So, like,
job as
user
engineers,
specific, when you say subtasks, is that kind of the view?
maybe not user specific depending on the user, but group
Okay.
specific for sure.
Ah,
So
yes.
hey, let's make a few changes in the way that the ECO process works and get our engineers more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe the next iteration is, hey, project managers are having a hard time categorizing how or organizing how the resources should be allocated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's do that for the next iteration. And you see, in that sense, we can take a very large project and break it down into very manageable chunks. And maybe over a 2-week or 3-week or a month period, we can introduce functionality that eases that process. So
Mm-hmm.
it makes organizational change management, which is this huge nebulous concept,
Yes.
it can break it down into these very small manageable pieces. And from there, it's easy for us to go in and say, hey, let's make a priority list of the things we want to get done. And
Mm-hmm.
then here's what we're going to spend on the first iteration. Here's what we're going to do the second iteration. Here's what we expect the third iteration, et cetera. And so it
And in
makes a,
between each, is the company like putting their users on the system
yep,
and actually using the functionality and
that is the exact end goal of every iteration. At
okay.
the end of an iteration, we want the users using that functionality.
I
To,
like the fact that you brought up reporting in your example, because I think
mm,
it's something that everybody can relate to, no matter, what they're doing. Because if you think, okay, I have 37 things that I want to report on, and you try to give people 37 brand new reports at once,
yeah,
how many reports are they actually going to look at?
right. And how many of them do they use every week, every day? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's another great question. And it's a perfect example of how we would break something down. Say you have 37 reports. Let's go through each one of them and see, number one, who they're important to. Number two, how often they're used. Number three, how much time does it take to make that report work?
Yes.
And number four, how accurate is the data that you're using for reporting?
Mm-hmm.
And each one of those things would need to be addressed for each one of those 37 reports.
Right.
Then, hey, Now we've got a priority list. This one's used the most. This one is the least accurate. This one we just like to have because it's a dashboard, and the CEO guys want to see a dashboard. Okay, so that's number 3.
Right, right. And of course, dashboards do have their uses,
Yeah.
but they're not the only thing that can
No,
work.
no, not at all. And in fact, what we find in the real world is the best reports are one of two things. Either they're BOM structures, where we're looking for specific things in a part structure, and with huge assemblies, that's always a big deal. But number 2 is project management, resource allocations, and reporting on that is probably the number 2 thing that we see.
Okay. Well, I think we've kind of circled around to a couple of different topics here, which is amazing, but it really does all flow into the same kind of thing, right? Which is when you're thinking about making any kind of change to your organization, who's going to be impacted? How mature are your processes and your systems today?
Yep.
Are you across the board getting the buy-in from your people that they're ready and willing to change, right? It's not going to be easy, right? Change is always hard.
Always hard.
And there are definitely certain aspects of change that are going to go really well for some people and not so well for other people. So how do you keep doing that iterative thing, to increase adoption, usability, comfort, happiness levels, and ultimately success levels?
Yep. And
so using Agile as your foundation for these iterations, how does that apply back to these internal teams and how they can make decisions and set themselves up for success?
Yeah, in a couple of the situations that we've seen, a company has set up what's called a PLM team, where they either have a couple of members from each one of the groups that are represented in the PLM process, not necessarily just in the tool, but in the entire process. Or we have one person who's in charge of the whole thing. And
Okay.
that one person is typically running a behind the scenes PLM team type meeting anyway. So lots of times when we find success, what we're trying to do is through each one of the iterations, address a top 1 or 2 things for each one of the groups that might be affected or might have significant problems in the process that need to get solved. And so by using Agile, it's a very nice way for we as software engineers and solution architects to organize the way that the work will be delivered. Part of the best practices that we see in software engineering with this agile process is iterative, not just iterative development, but iterative deliveries. And so every couple of weeks or maybe once a month, we're going to give you some software, and it's going to have new features, and we're going to address each one of those groups that's in the PLM team at least with 1 or 2 features. Maybe it's a bug fix. Maybe it's one of your 37 reports. Maybe it's data cleansing. Maybe you like to have a better login screen with a fancy logo. Who knows what it is? But the Agile process allows us to organize the things that are the top priorities and make those fixes first, make those features first, and add more and more functionality as we go. And it's at that in that sense, it's about refinement of the tool and refinement of the process rather than a huge change all at once, which, as you said before, is tough and it's hard and nobody likes it. Through an iterative process, we ease those changes into the organization, and it makes it easier to get that buy-in by everybody and to get everybody on board. And what we find is that everybody starts working with the tool earlier in the process, and we get better feedback. So as we refine, we get better and better adoption.
That actually makes a lot of sense, Michael. Thank you. Are there any other considerations that you think a company should be looking at before they start a technology project that's going to implement change?
Yeah, the one thing that we really haven't talked about today, Jennifer, is the real technical side.
Okay.
And as software engineers, when we go into a new client, especially, that's one of the first things that we want to take a look at. And this is kind of where I geek out. When I get there, the first thing I try to do is connect with the IT guys. Hey, are you using the cloud?
Right.
Do you have a server farm? Let's check out bandwidth. The really geeky stuff. And that puts a huge smile on my face. And I'm glad you laugh because, in sales, everybody laughs at the geeks.
Yeah. Geek and
But that's
hiding over here.
Yeah. But those are real big concerns. And, I think in a lot of cases, those aren't taken into account up front. And one of the things that we see, remember we talked before about naivete versus maturity.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, especially in companies that we deem that are kind of not PLM naive, they're also IT naive. So
Okay.
they come in and say, hey, we want to do this big change. Hey, we think a tool would help. They don't quite think it all the way through to the very end where the technical part has to be there. And so that's a big thing for us when we first get involved is to come in and assess where they are, not just in a business process sense, but technically as well.
So that overarching infrastructure and
Yep.
making sure that if they have just one location, right, that may be a little bit simpler, but
Yep.
if they have suppliers or other divisions that they're communicating with in different parts of the world, what it looks like over there,
Yep.
how their vault structures might need to be set up.
Yep.
So all of those
Absolutely.
things that are going to make the tool actually usable,
Yeah.
and
One
where
of the
does
things that
replication need to take place and all of that.
Yep, exactly. One of the things we see in a lot of cases is manufacturing plants and the ERP systems are in
Mm-hmm.
very different places than headquarters, which are
Mm-hmm.
in very different places than design centers. And so, cloud-based or client server-based solutions need to take those things into consideration as well.
Right.
One of the clients that we've been dealing with recently has a very, very complex PLM to ERP integration.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a software thing, it's also a networking thing. And their headquarters is in Europe and their design center is in Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a big consideration on how network
Just a little
speeds and
distance.
traffic, just a smidge. There's, network speeds and traffic and latency and redundancy, all of those things need to be taken into account. And,
Absolutely.
without having that technical discussion up front, lots of times you can design a beautiful system, but it's not going to work in the end because you
Yeah.
haven't taken those things into account.
Doesn't matter if there's no speed.
Right. Exactly. 5 minutes to load. I am not buying that tool.
No, that's way too long. Like 5 seconds is too long.
Yeah, anymore. That's right.
So awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michael. And
Of
really,
course.
any final thoughts or last words of wisdoms to share?
Last words of wisdom. I wish my kids would ask me that. Dad, I think one of the things to consider in all seriousness is as a business, there's kind of a fallacy that exists. And the fallacy is kind of twofold. If we throw more money at it, if we throw more tech at it, it'll go away. And especially here in the US, we kind of need to guide companies past that. And it's not that 9 women can have a baby in a month, and it never will be that way. And so sometimes you just have to accept the fact that things are hard, things are complex, and organizational change especially is one of those things. And so patience is required, and communication is required,
Mm-hmm.
and imagination is required.
Oh, I like that. Absolutely. Heavy dose of imagination.
Absolutely. Almost anything is possible, um, but it takes time to get there, and
Mm-hmm.
it takes resources to get there. And it's our job as consultants, as a consulting company, to guide you to get there. But it takes imagination and patience and endurance. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Michael, so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope to have you back
Anytime. That was
again
fun.
someday.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for joining us. We really appreciate the opportunity to share lots of insight and information with you about running technology projects and making them more successful in your organization, no matter what type of technology project you're doing. liked this content, make sure to hit that button and subscribe so you'll be alerted to future content. And of course, drop your comments or send me an email at jmo@minerva-plm.com about any questions that you have that you'd like to see addressed here. Thanks everyone and have a great day.